Jujutsu Kaisen, Hell's Paradise, and Chainsaw Man are all series that in the past few years have become favorites of mine. And because of this, from time to time, I naturally wonder what my ranking of these three manga is and how exactly I'm coming to that conclusion. So in this video, I'll be doing exactly that, comparing these three series on the basis of their storytelling ability, main characters, antagonists, supporting cast, world building, art, and fights, all in order to determine which of these is the best. And when comparing series in this manner, I think the only appropriate way to start off is by comparing their respective stories. This is a really interestingly difficult thing to do though, because if you've read all of these manga, you know that none of them really have a complex plot, and as such can't really be judged on the basis of complexity, nor their execution of said complexity. While each manga has their obvious nuances, I would say that as far as the general medium goes, Chainsaw Man, Jujutsu Kaisen, and Hell's Paradise are as normal as it gets. And this isn't a bad thing, rather it just speaks towards how normal they are in this department. Chainsaw Man probably stands out as the most unorthodox just due to its rather fast pacing, and I think this gives the story a unique flair to it, while simultaneously setting the audience's expectations of what kind of story they are getting themselves into. A good story is a consistent and entertaining story, and especially in Chainsaw Man Part 1, the narrative is consistently moving at breakneck speeds and is interesting the whole way through. I tend to like longer running stories that methodically build up to certain large scale events before executing them in a super climactic fashion, but Chainsaw Man basically just comes right out and says that it is taking a different approach from the start. I expect something totally different from this manga than I do with plenty other series, and that's because I think Fujimoto does an amazing job of setting that expectation from the jump. In comparison, I would say that Hell's Paradise makes an attempt to have the erratic pacing and story structure of Chainsaw Man with a little bit more of a conventional twist. Rather than the monster of the week style that Chainsaw Man adopts for a large percentage of its first part, from early on, Hell's Paradise establishes the primary big bads and keeps the main character's motivations consistent. The criminals just want to get the elixir of life and get a pardon. The Asaimon want to watch over these criminals and get back home in one piece, and the Tenzin want strong humans to create powerful town. Alliances change and personal feelings shift over the course of the story as you would naturally expect, but the main antagonistic forces remain the same, and for the most part, the story doesn't try to sweep the rug from under you and just chugs along right until the very end. I would say that the predictability of Hell's Paradise is what differs so much from Chainsaw Man when you consider their stories. Chainsaw Man has an element of chaos to it that links up very appropriately with the story that Fujimoto is trying to tell, and the story of Denji's life takes many twists and turns as his core beliefs change as well. Even an antagonist who was set up to be the final big bad was revealed to merely be a pawn on the chessboard for an even greater, grander villain who had been staring us right in the face. Because of how fast Chainsaw Man feels, this reveal hits you like a ton of bricks, and even on rereads continues to be a super impactful twist for the narrative. Of the two series, I would say that Chainsaw Man's is the least conventional and most entertaining when looking strictly at the story's concept and how each respective author executes on it. You can really tell that Fujimoto is a seasoned veteran when you take a look at his one-shots and all of his other stories, because he has clearly refined his storytelling ability through years and years of trial and error, only to come out with Chainsaw Man being one of his best and most unconventional. Hell's Paradise is great, and I think its story is very solid, but Chainsaw Man gets that leg up because of its unpredictability and because of how well I think Fujimoto was able to keep the pace going. Jujutsu Kaisen is the polar opposite of this. For the first 130 or so chapters of the manga, the story of JJK is rather normal, and it moves at a pretty regular pace. Normal isn't bad or inherently worse than weird, by the way. It simply means that there are more clearly identifiable tropes and plot beats in JJK than there are in Chainsaw Man. Chainsaw Man takes on the much less common villain of the week approach, while Gege writes Jujutsu Kaisen in a way that is clearly building towards something. Up until Shibuya, the story feels just like a bubble being blown, constantly expanding outwards, growing more and more, and then at a moment's notice, just popping and leaving you with nothing to hold on to. To me, this is when Gege's story writing was at its most compelling. The 80 or so chapters leading up to the Shibuya incident arc work twofold. They, on a surface level, just generally get us introduced to the main characters that we'll be interacting with throughout the series and get us connected and entertained. And on a second, deeper level, they act as one big build-up phase to the series' best arc yet. Build up, build up, build up, then boom. a measured and controlled sense of chaos erupts, throwing everything that had been established out the window and redefining the conventions of the series. When Gege was writing the story like this, I think that he was far and away the best storyteller of the three. I've already admitted my biases towards slow and methodical storytelling, but I also just think that in this case, Jujutsu Kaisen ended up with the better product narratively, until Gege's pacing and story structure shifted and didn't quite hold up to his old standard. You see, post-Shibuya, the build-up methodology that we had seen Gege so tactfully employ had been swapped out for a more continuous, jumbled style of storytelling that, in theory, could have matched up very well with the arc, the themes, and the tone that he was trying to set. I think that Jujutsu Kaisen ends up taking on a similar style to Chainsaw Man after the first act of the series, but unfortunately, I don't think that the story makes this stylistic change very gracefully. As a reader, for the longest time, I was confused as to why certain characters would just do things without much explanation, or where the story felt like it was happening to me rather than something that I was watching masterfully unfurl. If I had to put it simply, I would say that Gege's ambitions for the story are outweighed by the fact that he isn't simply willing to write the same way as he did before. A Shibuya-style arc, an arc that could be argued to be one of the best in the demographic, requires a tenuous amount of build-up and foundation to pull off. An arc like that only works because the past 80 chapters all exist for the sole purpose of making that one night, that one incident make sense and truly come together. I don't blame Gege for wanting to switch up the style. I don't blame Gege for deciding to ditch the really methodical, tenuous build-up phase that he did before. I think that's fine. I think as a creative it makes complete sense, but the execution is what really bothers me. If Gege wanted to adopt a more random style of storytelling after Shibuya, that's fine. If he wanted to be more ambitious and get even crazier and larger with his concepts, that's fine. But he can't do both at once, and a lot of my gripes with the narrative of JJK come from him trying to do two things together that I just don't think work. Extremely fast, hype, chapter-to-chapter content doesn't really work when you're trying to build up for an arc that is more ambitious than something that you were building up for 80 whole chapters. In contrast, Fujimoto's style of writing is consistent from chapter 1 to 97, and I respect the fact that he leans into the chaos and doesn't try to have his cake and eat it too. Chainsaw Man doesn't have an arc within it that is as ambitious as Shibuya or the Culling game. Fujimoto seems to understand the benefits and limitations of his speedy writing style and doesn't bother trying to make Chainsaw Man Part 1 something that it simply can't be. And when it comes to Part 2, so far at least, he hasn't really tried to do both styles. He seems to be going for a more methodical style of storytelling and going about the character writing more conventionally, making the chapter-to-chapter content lose its pop, but also allowing for the narrative to be clearly building to something special. I think this is the reason that many Chainsaw Man fans are turned off by Part 2. The bombastic style of writing that they expected from Fujimoto has been replaced with a much slower, much more conventional, much more methodical pace from him. To me, this level of awareness and control over your story is something that Gege kinda loses after Shibuya. And while it's obvious that the story is still great, I mean, I personally love it, I do think that he loses his competitive edge against Fujimoto when we get into the Culling games. So, while I love the story of Hell's Paradise, and I truly love the story of Jujutsu Kaisen, in terms of execution, Chainsaw Man has both of them beat. Shifting gears a little bit, I'd like to talk about the main characters of the Dark Trio, and this leads me to being in just as much anguish as I was when I was talking about the plot, but rather than simply thinking that all of them are just equally good or okay in their respective categories, this decision is really hard because I think all of the series mentioned have fantastic main characters and succeed in ways where the other just doesn't. Yuji doesn't have the narrative or screen time importance of Denji or Gabimaru just due to the nature of his power relative to everyone else's, but he surpasses them by a decent margin when it comes to his dynamic with his antagonists, as well as the quality of his major fights. Gabimaru doesn't really have the best antagonist to match up with him when it comes to that dynamic, and his character somewhat suffers for that, at least in comparison, but this is more than made up for when you realize just how refreshing of a character he is on the basis of his conception. A married man who has come to grips with the reality of his own humanity and then proceeds to fight the most powerful and terrifying creatures on the planet, all to get that very wife back, is just fun and fresh, especially in the shonen demographic, more so than Denji and certainly more so than Yuji. Denji kind of sits somewhere in the middle of all this. He has a better executed relationship with his antagonist than Gabimaru, but it doesn't hold up to Yuji with Mahito and Sukuna. And while the premise of his character isn't as immediately enticing as Gabimaru's, I do think that it is more interesting than Yuji's, at least on the basis of an idea. This leaves me at an unfortunate impasse of trying to reconcile all of these things simultaneously and come to a conclusion as to which protagonist I like the most. On any given day, you could probably hear me say that Denji is the best of the three, Yuji is the best of the three, or Gabimaru is the best of the three. And if all of that wasn't hard enough, neither Yuji nor Denji's story is over, and both characters could either significantly elevate from here on out or remain stagnant in a way that Gabimaru just didn't, and this adds yet another layer of depth and complexity into the discussion. Right off the bat though, if I had to take where these characters are right now, I would say that the one I would eliminate from the running is Denji. He's a great main character, great enough for this to be a really tough decision, great enough for him to be first place on another day in another list, but I think the fact that his character arc is the most undercooked right now helps me come to this conclusion. Chainsaw Man Part 1 centers around Denji almost exclusively, and in its short 97 chapters is able to really characterize him and have him grow and regress in a natural way along his journey of discovering his dreams and what he truly wants in the relationship that he forms around him. Part 2 of Chainsaw Man splits that protagonist time with Asa, and while this doesn't make Denji's character any worse, it certainly doesn't do him any favors to have to share screen time with another major character in a series that is already shorter than Jujutsu Kaisen and is only marginally longer than Hell's Paradise. Even if we count Asa and throw her into the mix, she just hasn't had enough development or screen time or just general growth to compare to the likes of Gabimaru or Yuji. I really love Denji's character arc, and even Asa's is shaping up to be good. I really think that Fujimoto is doing a great job with both of them, but I don't know if Denji in particular stacks up to what Gabimaru and Yuji are able to accomplish in their respective series. I certainly think that he will, and maybe once I get to see exactly what Fujimoto is cooking with his arc in part 2 of the series, I will absolutely eat my words and have to readjust this list in the future. However, as of right now, Denji's in an interesting state where he's already had a complete arc from start to finish in Chainsaw Man Part 1, and he's currently in his build-up phase in Part 2. The build-up is great, but when comparing that to Yuji being on the cusp of what I imagine to be the climax for his character, and Gabimaru's entire narrative already being wrapped up, I unfortunately have to say that Denji falls into the third spot for me. This leaves Gabimaru and Yuji fighting for that spot at the top, and this may seem like it goes against every single reason that I said Denji is in third place, but in spite of him being an absolute goat of a character, and one that we've seen a complete story for, Gabimaru has to concede the #1 spot to Yuji and hold that silver medal trophy. The reason he sits in second place instead of first here is simply because Gabimaru's greatest moments don't hit as hard as Yuji's. They aren't as great, and I think that's the case because he doesn't have the stacked villain lineup that Jujutsu Kaisen has. Sure, Gabimaru does have the benefit of being further along in his character journey relative to Yuji, but his peak moments don't have anything that contend with Yuji at his peak, and when talking about characters that are in my mind as consistently good and consistently even as these two, peaks and greatest moments are what's gonna push one over the edge. Gabimaru just doesn't have a moment that really moves me in the way that Yuji's I am you speech did. I know that gets hyped up to high heaven, and I understand if someone is annoyed by the fact that it is brought up here, but it's just such a great moment. Gabimaru is just as consistent, and some would argue that maybe even more so than Yuji, and he once again does really benefit from a conclusion that I know is satisfying, but Yuji just has 3 or 4 moments in Jujutsu Kaisen that cannot be matched by Gabimaru, and that's why he's not in first place here. Yuji at times is simply just too great to be matched by these other characters in my mind, and I can understand why someone would pick Gabimaru or Denji more. They're really that great, but when it comes down to it, Yuji is just my favorite. Now, this particular icing on the cake may be slightly unfair, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't expect Yuji's character resolution to just be spectacular, far and away surpassing anything else that he's ever done in the series. I know that Gege could absolutely fumble this and really rearrange how I feel about Yuji's entire narrative leading up to this point, but when I look at how well he's handled everything with him so far, I just can't imagine a world where he isn't able to deliver on everything he's promised. I hope I'm not jumping the gun there, but I really do think that Gege can pull off Yuji's character arc flawlessly. Regardless of that though, even if I don't hypothesize that Yuji's narrative conclusion comes and hits even harder than anything before, he's still my favorite protagonist of the 3, but it definitely isn't much of a gap between him, Denji, and Gabimaru in terms of quality. I simply value the protagonist-antagonist dynamics very highly when I'm reading a story, and Yuji really gets to elevate his character by having such a great relationship with his villains. Speaking of antagonists, I think it's time to discuss them and how they impact their respective manga. Now, if it hadn't been obvious, up to this point, I think the comparisons have been rather close for me. So close, in fact, that if I had made this video on another day, at another time, after another reread, you might have gotten a different answer. But when it comes to antagonists, I know exactly how I feel without much need for hesitation. Hell's Paradise is the worst antagonist of the three, Chainsaw Man is second, and Jujutsu Kaisen is first. Hell's Paradise doesn't have bad antagonists per se, but they are just rather plain and uninteresting when you are comparing them to what Chainsaw Man and Jujutsu Kaisen have to offer. Lord Tenzin just doesn't get the screen time, characterization, or personal relationship to the main cast in the same way that Makima or Sukuna does, and Tenzin suffers pretty heavily as an antagonist for that. They tie in pretty well with the themes and message of the story 100%, but the execution of them just isn't even in the same realm as the other two manga. Chainsaw Man obviously is a step above Hell's Paradise, and the biggest reason for that is the series' final antagonist, Makima. Makima is a really good villain who does just about everything that I think a good villain should do. She has a relationship with Denji that feels personal, she is intimidating, and her defeat signifies growth in the main character. If Chainsaw Man had one or two more Makimas, we may be having an entirely different discussion about the order of antagonists, but the series just doesn't have that yet. We have more minor villains like Rize and Kwang Shi, but those are at best pretty good and at worst just okay, and they don't really move the needle much in Chainsaw Man's favor, at least not when comparing them to the likes of Jujutsu Kaisen, which has Jogo, Mahito, Geto, Kenjaku, Sukuna, and Toji. Now I get it if you aren't locked into the Jogo agenda yet, that's alright, I got a video for y'all soon, but for everyone else, I think that JJK makes it pretty clear that it is just in its own league in regards to villains. Maybe I could see someone saying that Makima is individually better than every Jujutsu Kaisen villain. I would disagree with that idea. I would think that some characters are better, but it's not so crazy of a take that I wouldn't be able to entertain or have a discussion about it. What I couldn't entertain though is the idea that Makima, with the help of like Rize, makes up a better overall antagonistic force than Mahito, Sukuna, Geto, Kenjaku, and Toji. It simply isn't possible. Mahito's relationship with Yuji, his intensity, his intimidation, his charisma, and how he fundamentally alters Yuji's philosophy is all masterfully handled in Shibuya. Sukuna has been a long-term thorn in the world's side and has been a constant source of entertainment for the readers. Even if you don't see him as the deepest villain ever, it's undeniable that he provides a sense of danger and entertainment that you just can't ignore. Geto, while short-lived, was a very good character who did some really heinous things due to how the trauma of being a Jujutsu sorcerer affected him. I think in terms of pure narrative or character development value, he is one of the best. Kenjaku is another character that's similar to Sukuna, who has been pulling the strings from behind the scenes for God knows how long, and we still haven't fully seen what's going on in his head yet. And Toji is just a tragically cool character. I'm sorry, but it's just so clear that Jujutsu Kaisen has the better antagonists, and this isn't even counting all of the minor villains that we get to see in the arcs following Shibuya. Higuruma, Reggie, Ishigori, Kashimo, all of them are all very entertaining and very fun, and even if you completely ignore them and pretend that they don't exist, JJK has the better villain lineup. Now, unfortunately for JJK though, I don't think it will have such an easy time securing the #1 spot when talking about supporting cast. In fact, one of my biggest gripes with Jujutsu Kaisen has been about how it executes on the side character development and stories. I love Gojo, Nanami, Todo, Megumi, and many other characters that find themselves in a supporting role for a large part of the series. However, I oftentimes feel like Jujutsu Kaisen's pacing lends to some characters getting left in the dirt or simply rushed to a degree that I'm not fond of. Chainsaw Man, in comparison, isn't a series that has this particular criticism for me, not because I think it handles its supporting cast any better than JJK's, but more because I don't care if a lot of the side characters get focused in Chainsaw Man. I know that sounds weird, but Fujimoto doesn't really frame characters outside of the very core cast as important or all that interesting, so when they don't do all that much or don't interest me in the slightest, it doesn't bother me. I wasn't really expecting anything from them. Gege kind of suffers from making his side characters too compelling without being willing to do anything for them sometimes, and Fujimoto just doesn't seem to make an effort to stack the side cast up like that. Aside from Aki, Power, Yoshida, Angel, and more recently Nayuta, I don't think that Fujimoto really tries to make everyone in the world a serious character, at least not yet. Characters like Beam are cool, I guess, but he's just a goofy comic relief character that helps Denji get out of dodge sometimes. Kishibe Ibe is a particularly cool devil hunter, but on a character level, there is really no connection to be had there. Even Kobeni, one of the most beloved Chainsaw Man side characters, doesn't really feel like she matters to the story, and she certainly doesn't matter to me. I honestly don't hate this approach to writing your supporting cast, and I think it works well with what Fujimoto is trying to accomplish in the series. When talking strictly about the quality of characters aside from the protagonist and antagonist, neither Jujutsu Kaisen nor Chainsaw Man can have this honor. You can arrange them in whatever fashion you want, but just know that neither of them are number one. That goes to Hell's Paradise, and I feel like most people who have read all three series can attest to why this is the case. Yuji Kaku opts to keep his core characters limited with the advantage of giving every single one focus, purpose, and depth in a way that you just can't do with a cast as large as JJK's without the story length to compensate. Sagiri, Shion, Fuchi, Gentetsusai, Nurugai, Chobe, and Toma are all amazing characters in their own right, and they get entire fights or mini arcs of themselves that can only exist because of how much Yuji Kaku focuses on them. Sagiri especially is a character that has my praise just because of how she pulls even with Gabimaru in terms of enjoyability and writing quality. She gets a relative amount of screen time to Gabimaru, her development makes just as much sense as his, and the care that the author takes to really flesh out her interactions with the world of Hell's Paradise just speaks volumes to Yuji Kaku's philosophy when it comes to creating a great supporting cast. No matter where you go, if you find someone who has read Hell's Paradise and doesn't hate it, you will find someone who read the series and thought that the supporting cast was great. Long story short, pound for pound, Hell's Paradise has the best side characters out of the three. When it comes to world building though, we are back to square one in regards to the difficulty of deciding. Now, world building in general is a pretty tough concept to evaluate, even as someone who talks about series analytically on a regular basis. What makes a conversation that could be 30 minutes alone into a more palatable discussion is the fact that all of the manga I am talking about today take place in what I'd like to call a modified reality. Maybe that's a pre-existing term already, I don't know, I just made it up so I could talk about it in a more coherent fashion. Essentially what I mean by that is that all of these stories use real life at some point as a framework and then build their respective world off the back of that. Jujutsu Kaisen and Chainsaw Man make that especially clear, but Hell's Paradise does that as well, just significantly further back in time. None of these manga find themselves crafting a world completely from scratch, which makes comparing them that much simpler, but unfortunately because of how similar they are, it took quite a bit of rereading and thought to really decide which series I thought had constructed their world the best and most consistently. On one hand, you have Hell's Paradise and the Island, something that could be considered a world in and of itself, described and given lore by the gods of that world. You have a power system that is introduced later into the series and is then explored on a somewhat surface level, simply because the characters themselves aren't quite masters of it either. I don't drop points for Yuji Kaku not delving into the inner workings of Tao, because no protagonist in the series, no perspective character really knows about Tao on a very fundamental level. While I would love to have a Nen or Cursed Energy level understanding of the power, that just isn't necessary or helpful to the type of story that Hell's Paradise is. Jujutsu Kaisen definitely integrates its supernatural world a bit more into the real one, and it's not necessarily better or worse just on the basis of concept, but I do enjoy the fact that the problems of Jujutsu society somewhat affect the world on a larger scale. Gege also makes an attempt to include global politics, although his political writing leaves a lot to be desired, with him often just creating cool concepts and executing them with zero vigor. Cursed Energy as a power system does contribute to the world building though, and it's good enough to make up for what I think Gege lacks in real world integration. Still, I find myself often wishing that many of the ideas introduced about the clans, higher ups, and many components that allow Jujutsu Society to even move forward were explored in any meaningful way. I would say that I rate JJK a bit higher than Hell's Paradise on the world building totem pole, just due to the complexity and ambition that is found when it comes to Jujutsu Kaisen's world. Call me a little bit biased, but I value that ambitious nature a little bit more than staying reserved. Chainsaw Man goes for an approach that is more similar to Jujutsu Kaisen's, but I think it takes it just a bit further. Rather than make devil hunters and devils limited to just Japan, Fujimoto decides to make his problems global, and I gotta say that I think it gives the series a bit of extra pop in the world building department. Hell's Paradise and Jujutsu Kaisen really go for that insulated society type of vibe with their world building, and that's more than fine, but I just prefer Chainsaw Man making a phenomenon as difficult to contain as devils the entire world's problems. Not only does it just feel like it makes a lot of sense without having to jump through too many hoops, but it adds an extra political element that the other two don't really have. Hell's Paradise has the Shogun and JJK has the higher ups, but neither really act as anything other than an ambiguous boogeyman that doesn't have any real demonstrated power. In Chainsaw Man, the mysterious powers that be aren't all that relevant either, but countries are. America is a superpower that is a large part of an extremely powerful devil, making a very obvious connection to American reality, and generally giving the world of Chainsaw Man a unique kind of tension that cannot be acquired through other means. So with all that being said, I gotta say that Chainsaw Man is the best of the three for me when it comes to world building and how they establish their respective universes. Now, just like with world building, the art of a manga is integral to every aspect of that series. Just like every category I've gone through in this video, in fact, you can't really have a manga or series in general reach its peak without art to match. Jujutsu Kaisen and its art is a subject that comes up a lot for me as a big fan of the series, and I have to say, it's very hit or miss for me. You see, Gege Akutami's style has changed significantly during his time writing the manga, and in his journey so far, I have personally broken up his style into three main distinctive chunks, with only the middle chunk being at a level that I think truly competes with the other two manga I am discussing in this video. This prime Gege for me spans from Origin of Obedience to the tail end of the Shibuya Incident arc, so it's honestly a pretty great stretch for him. However, most everything else in the series that falls outside of that window is good, but not up to the level that the other series I am talking about are today. For 79 chapters, Gege is able to function at a level that might just be my favorite out of the Dark Trio, but that also just means that for over 140 chapters he isn't, and that inconsistency really hurts his standing in this race. His quality depiction of fights could maybe pick up some slack in this category, but since fights are going to get their own section later in this video, I won't be incorporating that aspect in particular into my analysis of the art. And if Jujutsu Kaisen can't fall back on how good the fights look, and is just the most inconsistent of the three manga, it has to fall here, leaving only Chainsaw Man and Hell's Paradise. Both manga clearly have their ups and downs, and both are even stylistically really messy series, which makes this comparison all the more difficult because there isn't a large gap between them. Chainsaw Man has the advantage of having what I find to be a general composition that is better than that of Hell's Paradise's, and does a really good job of illustrating emotions in a nuanced and oftentimes funny way. The way that Denji posts up after a fight is always cool, and the manga can have a very cinematic flavor to it when Fujimoto is really turning up the heat. Hell's Paradise doesn't really have the elite framing that can be found in Chainsaw Man, but in spite of its messy art style, it still maintains a level of visual clarity that I don't think can be found in most of Fujimoto's work. Chainsaw Man can really be a hard series to follow when Fujimoto decides to put a lot on the page, but I think this problem doesn't affect Yuji Kaku as much, or at least to the same degree as with Chainsaw Man. On top of this, it's clear that the structural drawings in Hell's Paradise far surpass anything that the other two series produce. The backgrounds and settings in this manga really set the scene and set a tone that just isn't matched by Chainsaw Man. Honestly, I could keep going back and forth between both series, going over what one does better than the other and how they all even out for hours and hours and hours, and still think that they are relative. Fujimoto and Yuji Kaku are just that good when it comes to artistic ability. Yuji Kaku has better volume covers and use of color in general, but Fujimoto has the cooler double page spreads, etc, etc, etc. I'd love to just give the point to both of them and call it a day, but I can't. And when forced to make a decision of this magnitude, I can only fall back on the one thing that one of these artists have over the other. I think that Tatsuki Fujimoto has a higher level of creativity than Yuji Kaku, and this simply leads to him drawing cooler shit. The reason I give him and his series the slightest of advantages over Hell's Paradise is not because he necessarily draws better than him, but because the things he decides to draw are cooler, and I think that as an artist, part of your job is coming up with interesting things to make. Don't get it twisted, Hell's Paradise has some amazing concepts, monster designs, and basic abilities that look cool, but Fujimoto really struck gold with his devil designs, and even just how he decides to frame certain shots and set up certain conflicts through his art shows a greater understanding of entertainment through art, through illustrations, through visuals than Yuji Kaku. You can tell that Fujimoto is really a master of his craft just by his design and composition choices in the manga. It's close. It's real close. But at the end of the day, I have to put Chainsaw Man just a hair over Hell's Paradise in the art department. I mentioned fights being a particular individual category that I'd be mentioning in this video, and one could argue that fights or battles are simply an extension of art and should have been part of the discussion in the previous category, and while I can see why someone would say that, just due to how impactful the art quality, composition, and choreography matter to the delivery of a fight, I think that they aren't entirely connected either. I also think that since all of the series I am talking about are so focused on fighting, the quality of each respective manga's fights are an important metric to measure with. Character progression, the dynamic dynamics between the people in any given fight, and the overall use of the established power system and abilities all contribute to creating a good fight in a manga. And out of these three, Jujutsu Kaisen is the one that I think handles it the best. This is something that I think a lot of people would technically agree on, and I think it's one of the things that Jujutsu Kaisen is most praised for. But even though I think JJK's art only really peaks for about 3 arcs of the series, those 3 arcs are home to some of the most energetic and subversive fights I've seen in recent shonen. Yuji and Nobara versus Eso and Kechisu, Megumi versus the Finger Bearer, Gojo versus Toji, and almost every single fight in the Shibuya Incident arc are all top tier in respect to their paneling. There honestly isn't much more that I could ask for from Gege during that insane stretch of chapters. Even when talking about just the visual element, Gege is in a league of his own. Jujutsu Kaisen is also home to fights that truly progress the characters in a way that I think Chainsaw Man and Hell's Paradise can compete with, but not truly surpass. Yuji's development in his fight against Maiso is particularly entertaining, and the conclusion to that fight is still etched in my mind, and one of my favorite moments in the entire series. Chainsaw Man has some moments that are on this level when it comes to the narrative and Denji's growth, but I don't think Fujimoto has ever hit in the way of combat on the same level of Gege. The chaotic nature is certainly there, but there is a level of methodicalness to it that is missing, and it just isn't made up for by some other X factor. His fight with the Gun Devil and you-know-who did spectacular things for the story of Chainsaw Man and Denji in particular, but a fight isn't solely made up of its narrative components. How that fight is illustrated and demonstrated also matters. I would say that Chainsaw Man makes its way into second place here because I still do really like the visual depictions of the fights, and I think Fujimoto does have a unique way of keeping the tension and interest high. Yuji Kaku, however, isn't my favorite in the fighting department. I talked about this in my in-depth Hell's Paradise art analysis, which you guys can go check out, but I really don't think that this series has the best fights artistically speaking. Just like with Jujutsu Kaisen and Chainsaw Man, the story told by the fights in Hell's Paradise are amazing. Gabimaru, Sagiri, Chobe, Toma, and every other prominent character in the series all benefit from their fights as characters and typically as people living within the world of Hell's Paradise as well. Where the series fails is making those amazing stories and moments translate to striking and entertaining visuals. My main gripe just comes down to the Hell's Paradise fights being choreographed rather plainly, but I also think that because the power system is rather limited and smaller in scale, at least when compared to Chainsaw Man and JJK, Yuji Kaku had far less options to actually get wild with his action. Gege has the benefit of being able to construct the most physics-breaking power that he can think of, and Fujimoto can create a devil that can have every power under the sun, but with Tao, or at least with the way Tao is used for a majority of the series, the same versatility is not available. This doesn't make the fights bad by any means, but not looking the best certainly doesn't do them any favors in a comparison to the other series. Here's a good way to quantify exactly what I'm talking about. If the total score of a manga's fights were split into 2 categories, one being the story behind the fight, and the other being how interesting the fight is to look at, Jujutsu Kaisen, Chainsaw Man, and Hell's Paradise would all score a 45 out of 50 in the storytelling department. But where the gaps start to show is when you compare the actual depiction of that story, in which JJK would probably have a 45 out of 50, Chainsaw Man would have a 35 out of 50, and Hell's Paradise would have a 30 out of 50. So even though they pull even story-wise, when you combine both of their scores, JJK ends with a score of 90, Chainsaw Man ends with an 80, and Hell's Paradise would end with a 75. None of these scores are bad by any means, but it's clear which one would be the best. So while I love all of these manga and I think all of them have great fights, I gotta say that Jujutsu Kaisen is the clear winner for me here. Now, throughout this video, I've talked about 7 different categories, with Hell's Paradise winning 1, Chainsaw Man winning 3, and Jujutsu Kaisen winning 3. I honestly surprised myself with some of my takes once I started diving into the thought process I had behind them. Art was a really big surprise for me, especially because when I was just thinking about it, I imagined that JJK was going to win, and it ended up coming in last for me in that category. That being said, here are my thoughts on all of these series relative to each other. If it wasn't clear, I thoroughly love and enjoy each and every manga that I talked about in this video. I really hope that it did not come off like hate or like I'm slandering any of the series. I genuinely enjoy each and every one, and you can probably tell that from the analysis that I have for all of them on my channel. I've made videos on all 3 of them, and I can only really do that because of how much I enjoy them. That being said, lining up pretty close with what I figured was going to be in last place, I have Hell's Paradise. I honestly think that with the exception of Antagonist, Yuji Kaku's manga has a legitimate argument for winning almost any of these given categories. Gabimaru as a main character holds his own with Denji Denji and Yuji, the story of Hell's Paradise has a unique feel to it that breaks the conventional battle shonen experience, even more so than JJK and Chainsaw Man, and the art is phenomenal. Good enough to once again have an argument for first place. Hell's Paradise really doesn't leave anything to be desired outside of a compelling antagonistic cast and great fights. It just had some really steep competition. Chainsaw Man and Jujutsu Kaisen are some of the best manga out right now as far as I'm concerned, and just from the way I talk about each of them, I'm sure you can see why I think so. Now, by the end of this video, I had these two manga tied with respective scores of 3-3, but that doesn't necessarily mean I like them equally. It means it's close, but it's not necessarily completely even. Well, Chainsaw Man fought to the bitter end, and just like Hell's Paradise has a legitimate argument to be first place in every category here outside of fights, I think JJK just won the more important battles for the most part. I've gone on record numerous times just saying that I am a sucker for characters more than anything, so if you give me great characters with everything else being lackluster, I would probably still enjoy the story. So JJK winning out both the protagonist and antagonist sections of this video was really the 1-2 punch that it needed to put Chainsaw Man down. The story is outshined, the world building is inferior, and the art is worse than Chainsaw Man as far as I'm concerned, but for someone with my sensibilities, for someone that looks for characters and looks for those dynamics, it hardly matters because JJK won the things that truly mattered to me as a reader. Now, this may not be a surprise for a lot of people. I'm kind of a resident JJK fanboy, but I can't stress enough how close of a matchup this was and how hard it was to decide a winner for some of these categories. And at the end of the day, I did this all in the pursuit of fun and discussion with no ill intention or hate for any of these manga. I know people are going to think that regardless. Why did I compare them? Blah, 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 blah. But hey, it's fun, and I think it's going to spark a little bit of an interesting conversation. For all those curious, Hell's Paradise is an 8.5 out of 10 for me overall, Chainsaw Man is a 9, and Jujutsu Kaisen is also a 9, albeit a slightly higher one. If you made it to the end of the video, let me know what your personal rankings look like down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, consider subscribing, hitting the bell, and commenting your thoughts on which series I should compare in this style next. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.